I've got a problem with goblins. A goblin problem. When are you gonna start goblin these nuts? You know what goblins are, or maybe you don't. Because there's a lot of different interpretations of goblins, whether from Tolkien, where it was just goblins are equivalent to orcs, or in the movies where goblins were smaller, weaker versions of orcs. In fairy and folkloric lore, goblins were often associated with spirits of greed and were often not inherently violent, but often malicious. They would attempt to steal from you. They would be thieves that would attempt to outwit you, oftentimes failing in the process. And then you have modern renditions, which is more like gremlins and cannon fodder, and the idea of like the D&D goblin that has 6 hit points and that you can take them out in a single swing of your sword kind of deal. I'm just a level 1 goblin! Please don't swing your sword at me! But there's also more to goblins, as Curious Archive describes in their video, The Goblin Hypothesis, which isn't what inspired this video, but is what prompted me to make it, which kind of is the same thing, but I had the idea for the video before I watched Curious Archive's video. If you watch their video, you'll see why I'm making this one. But there's more to goblins than just the modern preconceptions. You have stuff like Goblin Core, which is showing the beauty of nature and being a hoarder in odd and strange ways, almost like the cute aspect of ugly things. You can have cute goblins, like look at these adorable little creatures from Joe Cat. They're fantastic, and they're goblins. Or you could have goblins be silly little guys who get adopted by your D&D party, and you have like Boblin the Goblin who becomes the mascot or sometimes a pet to the party. It's kind of weird where that line gets drawn. But at the same time, there are all these variations, meaning you can have goblins who are cannon fodder and goblins who are silly little guys that the party adopts in the same setting, and sometimes even in the same session. Oftentimes even from the same group or tribe or whatever. So how do you deal with that? The goblin problem. As far as I see it, there's around 3 solutions, really like 3.5. The first one is that you just treat goblins as entirely cannon fodder or as entirely silly little guys. This is the simplest approach, and it's also the best for anyone who doesn't want to delve into like the morality of you have an adopted goblin and you're going off to slay the goblin horde. That's kind of weird, that's kind of silly. If all goblins are evil or all goblins are good, then you have no issues there. It's the simplest. Another approach is that you have some goblins are cannon fodder and some are silly, and this is the most pragmatic approach because goblins are not a monolith. They're just a group of creature types that all come together. You can even delineate things like a goblin versus a bugbear versus a hobgoblin, all of which are goblinoids. However, even though this is probably the most common portrayal of goblins, where you have this mixture of silliness and also cannon fodder, some players don't like that. For instance, a fellow content creator I know has brought up the idea that if there is one goblin that can be redeemed, then that means that all of them should be able to be redeemed, and thereby it is not morally right to slay goblins or fight goblins without trying to redeem them, because much in the same way of Finn from the Star Wars sequel trilogy, if one stormtrooper can be redeemed, all of them theoretically can be redeemed. And that means that taking hostile actions towards stormtroopers is no longer a universal good. It now has to be interrogated. The third approach is that goblins are silly, but they're forced into being cannon fodder by society. This one is the most narrative weight and plot significance, and it's the one that you would want to focus on if you're running a goblin-centric story. But outside of that, it's really too heavy to apply as a side plot or just an undercurrent if you're not going to explore it. Do you really want this plot point in your game? Do your players? Are you or your players going to be comfortable with a group that has had its autonomy and culture stripped from it and it's forced into being either savage or brutal or violent against their will, and that you would have to deal with the ramifications of any that you slayed were ones that did not want to fight against you, and you will have to deal with the moral ramifications of that? Because that's the sort of questions you have to ask if you're running this third option. I don't really have an answer to the goblin problem. I call it the goblin dilemma, but one, that doesn't sound as nice, and two, what you choose is up to your individual group. You might have a clear answer to the goblin problem that your group is fine with. Do that. But on a broader term, I'm thinking, what place do goblins fit? But not only goblins, what other creatures that are similar, quote unquote, cannon fodder enemies, like orcs and kobolds, and other non-explicitly malevolent or benevolent forces? Because it's one thing to fight an army of demons. You know they're going to be evil. Even if they're sympathetic or they have understandable motivations, which again just makes them sympathetic, they're evil, they're demons. But an orc? An orc warband? Are they evil to the core? Were they made in the mud under the fires of Mount Doom? Or are they sentient individuals that have their own culture that have to expand their territory lest they will run out of resources? And do you want to ask the Goblin Problem for every single creature type in D&D? Is there going to be a different answer for kobolds versus goblins versus orcs? And if there is, then does that go against the point of what story you're trying to tell? So yeah, that's just a quick little video about this idea I had about the implications of what having a cannon fodder enemy type in a TTRPG game would be like. Goblins are the obvious example, but again, this goes for most different creature types, whether it's orcs or kobolds, or even things like gnolls, which have demonic influence. I see no reason why you can't have a good gnoll. They're more animalistic than they are demonic. So just remember to keep this in mind next time you're running goblins and next time the party wants to adopt one while slaughtering the rest. Because I don't think that goblin is going to be able to have any amount of therapy that will have it emotionally recover. Have fun!